Did everybody hear that?
Oh.
So it sounds,
Yeesh.
yeah, it sounds like your call is very important to us. So
Couldn't they get Magil Barrett's voice to do that?
I do wonder sometimes, you know, if we could just, we need to think about the aesthetics of these recordings and the automated voices we hear. I think we could go, we would be a lot better off. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm pretty certain, I'm pretty certain that this is the first Zoom defense in the English department at ISU. I know other departments have been doing them. So congratulations, Noran, you get to be the first participant. Obviously, I should just say at the outset, because this is being done on Zoom, because it's the first one, if we encounter any technological glitches, those don't, we'll try and remedy them as quickly as we can. Those obviously don't affect how you do, but hopefully those will be at a minimum. We'll find out, I guess. And thanks for everybody for being here. It's nice to see everybody virtually after some time away. So at the outset, I'll just say a little bit about the logistics of this. I think everybody's generally familiar with how these defenses go, but because it's a new virtual environment, it might be good to talk about them. So again, I am recording the meeting. Noran's recording the meeting as well. We will stop the recording at about 11:30, I think, for about an hour and a half or so, depending on, you know, how the conversation goes, but generally speaking around then. We will have Noran leave the meeting and the committee will deliberate. And obviously that portion is not going to be recorded. So so we'll pause the recording or stop the recording at that point as the committee deliberates. Now, usually the candidate just leaves the room. I guess in some metaphorical sense, you will be leaving the room, you'll be leaving the meeting. And I think I will either text or email you, whichever seems handier, once the committee has finished deliberating, to kind of bring you back into the meeting, where we'll talk a little bit about how you did and about our assessment. Okay. So like like most dissertation defenses in the English department, we'll start with Noran saying a little bit. You prepared a few things that you wanted to talk about at the outset, just to sort of guide the discussion a little bit. All the committee members will have questions for you. And we're looking forward to this conversation. Again, because it's on Zoom, there may be little hiccups with audio. Body language is a little harder to read. So, you know, if there's a pause while we gather our thoughts, or, you know, trying to be polite and see who will, it's like, you know, Midwesterners at a four-way stop, you know, there may be some pauses that wouldn't normally be there in an in-person defense, but that's okay. So we understand those little things. So that's pretty much the gist of things. And I understand, Noran, you were telling me that the graduate school has asked that at the end of the defense we have to do a photo. They call it a selfie, but it's not technically a selfie unless it's just a picture of yourself.
Yeah, like a screenshot of thumbs up.
Yeah. Okay. So we have to do a screenshot of everybody. Okay. So we can do that at some point near the end, or we could do it in the middle and just throw everything off.
I want one of those fake hands,
right?
Giant hands.
Yeah, or just get an Incredible Hulk fist or something like that. Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, there we go. Nice. Okay. Yeah. You're already well ahead of.
You have to teach us how to do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure, I can do that.
So great. The other thing too is if you haven't used, I'm assuming everybody here has used Zoom before. But I did just mention there is a chat feature here where you can type notes to everyone. Sometimes if audio goes out, but your video is working, that can be an easy way to participate if we need to use it. I did find out though, Zoom I sent out an announcement as a company saying that, you know, there is a private function where you can chat with individuals privately, but that's all collected in a recording. I don't expect we're going to be privately chatting, but don't, because it'll be saved in the so it's not anonymous. It'll be saved in the recording. Okay. So as we get started, just before we begin, does anybody have any questions that we should go over? I mean, not questions for the dissertation, but yeah, Noran.
Technical question. Would you like me to mute myself while you guys are asking questions, or is
Oh,
it?
that's a good question. I mean, everybody's unmuted right now. I typically, when I'm not, I'm obviously this is different, but when I'm not talking, I'll usually mute myself. Because I'm using headphones, kind of poor quality headphones, but there shouldn't be too much feedback. But because I have two small children and a barking dog, I'm probably going to mute myself when I'm not speaking going forward, just so you don't hear any of that. So if you'd like to do that, that's fine. Really, I think it's just to make sure there's no feedback or no echo or anything like that. But I'm not experiencing. Is anybody else having any audio issues?
No, I'm not getting any.
Okay, seems pretty good to me. So yeah, it's use your discretion. If a garbage truck goes by or something, you might want to mute, or more barking dogs. But otherwise, I think it's okay.
Okay.
Good question.
I quickly want to just mention that my wife teaches fitness, and so currently she streams fitness, and she's currently doing it right now. Our schedule is online. So if you hear something that sounds like thunder or yelling, it's just that.
We might have to join that after this.
I know, right?
Yeah.
A couple of hours, that'd be nice.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, I'm trying to get more exercise, so this is a good plan. Post defense, we'll all have a nice workout. Yeah.
That's a fun idea. We should do department workouts.
I don't know, lifting heavy intellectual issues is good exercise.
That's
exactly.
Got to burn some calories.
Exercising my mind. All right. Well, in that case, if we're all good to go, let's go ahead and begin. So I've already welcomed everybody. I just want to say too at the outset, congratulations, Noran, for getting to this point. It's a significant amount of work that goes into writing a dissertation. So just getting to the defense itself, I think, is something to be proud of. So we're looking forward to this defense, to the conversation, and to hearing your thoughts about some of the questions we have. So I know you have a few things you wanted to say at the outset, and then we'll get into it. So whenever you're ready, feel free to tell us.
I am. I can go ahead. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here despite what's happening in the world right now. And thank you for helping me throughout this journey on different levels. Like each of you has done great things to me throughout my academic journey. So it's great that we're sort of celebrating all of this now. I just wanted to start with this note on what I think of this project right now that it's finished, that I can totally see a document that's like I can call a finished document. I can call it that because I finished the dissertation, but what I think about it is that it's just a dissertation. I've been reading this book, it's just a dissertation throughout the process of writing it. And now I like these words of it's just a dissertation make more sense, because when I read it for the very last time, I realized how much work I would need to do beyond this process, of finishing the defense and like getting done with the PhD. And it's basically because I noticed it's a good idea. I feel like the interrogative mode, or what I present in this project, is a good idea, is a good starting point or a good seed that can lead to not necessarily a book, but actually a series of books that sort of benefit from different disciplines. Like I present an idea and I present a model or a blueprint for a bigger project that I'm working on in the future. So I'm hoping that this conversation today will lead me to at least like outlining a plan of where I need to go beyond the dissertation. So I just wanted to let you know that I understand it's just a dissertation, there's more to do. And that's why I'm hoping that, as I said, our conversation will lead me to the departure points for the future projects that I hope I'll work on beyond this.
Great, thank you. Good. I'm glad we'll dive right into it. Maybe based on a little bit of what you said, I have some initial questions. I mean, one of the things that I think is important about what you said is that idea of, you mentioned that idea of a dissertation as part of an intellectual process. On the one hand, it's a kind of encapsulation of the work you've been doing, but it's also, as you said, a set of ideas that are going to continue to be further refined, or that are going to be worked in different ways and applied in different ways. So along those lines, I'm actually going to ask you to go back quite a bit, because the dissertation, the introduction kind of starts with a personal anecdote, of how you came to comics or how you understand comics, and we'll go a little bit farther into the future. But I'm wondering about the interrogative mode and just the impetus for it, right? Because you suggest that there are things that drew you to this kind of model, and a lot of times a dissertation comes out of the fact that a person sees a problem that they want to solve, right, or an issue that they want to address. And I'm wondering for you, when you think back to what drew you to the interrogative mode or to creating this, what kind of problems were you hoping to solve? Like, what kind of problems did you see in your field or these different areas of study that really led you to write this kind of a dissertation?
Sure. So as a literature major, I was used to, like the literary devices available to every literature student, like the type of devices that you use for analyzing literature. And when I started reading comics proper, like as a graduate student, I felt like these can't be the methods applied that can be applied to a visual medium, or a medium that combines visual aspects or visual elements with words. And I felt then that there was something missing. There was something that I needed to learn in order to address some of the aspects that I saw, where I felt like none of the literary devices that I'm used to were applicable or useful. Some of them were, like there were some instances where I felt like, yes, deconstruction works here, or structuralism works here, or something like that. But there was nothing, at least like in my knowledge, there was nothing that was as helpful as, like when I looked at like just prose and used the literary devices I'm used to, and like they came handy and they were very applicable. So that's what sort of prompted me to try to dig deep and find some literary, or like critical devices that can help me with this medium that I felt like needed a different critical lens than what I was used to.
Could you say a little bit more? I'm interested in the point about the visual, right? That literary studies methods, it sounds like you're suggesting that literary studies methods maybe work only insofar as comics have words, right? And of course, as you mentioned in one of your chapters, like not all comics have, where I think you talk about Jason and silent comics, or what you call pantomime comics. But I'm wondering, like, is it just the case that the literary doesn't work well? Well, let me put it this way: what aspects of the visual does literary studies not do very well? So, for instance, I'm thinking about like, theme. Theme is something that would seem like you could study in both a literary and a visual way. But what elements of the visual do you think literary studies doesn't really address?
I think that the idea of knowing how to talk about visuals, like what kind of language to use for talking about visuals. And this is something that having a text like Cloud's Understanding Comics does a little bit, but it gives me the language without telling me how to use it, or like how to use it for reading a certain comic. So I feel like it was the language that I needed, and I felt like it was the just the tool that tells me what the visuals could mean, or like what's the relation, like how can I understand the relationship between visuals and words that was missing. And that's why I felt like the literary devices available were great for understanding something, as you said, like theme, but those relationships, the relationships between the visual elements and the themes, or the words that lead you to infer the themes, is what I thought needed more direction, needed more instruction, which I couldn't find in the literary criticism that I used for prose.
Okay, yeah. Well, and maybe this is a related question then. So if literary studies, if you think that literary studies is maybe lacking in how it approaches visual material, comic studies would seem like it might be okay, right? Comic studies seems like as a discipline, it should be able to handle the visual and the verbal. But of course, your first chapter really goes into a lot of detail about what the major strands of comics criticism are and what you find valuable or less so, right? So I'm wondering, this is like kind of what that chapter does, but I'm wondering if you could give us sort of your overview of what comic studies looks like, right? What do you think are the central attributes of comic studies? And this will lead into some questions about, I want to hear a little bit more about what you think it does well and what it doesn't as a field. And of course, that's bearing in mind that fields have tons of different practitioners and subfields. And so, you know, an approach to comic studies you might see from one kind of scholar would obviously be different than another. So we'll get into the specifics of that in a bit. But I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you take the state of comic studies to be. Because you not only kind of take literary studies to task a little bit in the dissertation, but you also do that with comic studies too. So what's your impression of what comic studies is like right now, and what are the things it does well and doesn't do so well?
I think what's great is that each critic or theorist focused on an important aspect of comics. They took each of the aspects and they worked on them individually. I feel like each critic wanted to just focus on this one aspect and provide readers with classifications and sort of a taxonomy of like what are the different types of this, the different forms of this aspect and so on and so forth. Like panel layout or page layout, for example, you'll have a different types of classifications of those, or like with visual verbal synergy, for example, there are some authors that say that, for example, we focused enough on the visuals. Let's look at the language, like Hannah Mayodrak, for example, who talks a little bit about what language does in comics and wants to direct one's attention to what the words do in comics and so on and so forth. So I feel like each of them does something great on its own. I mean, like something helpful, but it doesn't connect what it does to other aspects and other elements that make comics what they are. So if I'm interested in seeing what page layout or panel layout do in a specific comics, I will go to someone like Benoit Peters, for example, and I'll look at the classifications and what each of them, what are the classifications, each of the classifications do and things like that in order to understand how this works in a given comic. Or if I want to look at the function of words, I will go to Hannah Mayodrak and see what she presents or offers to readers in order to think about words in comics and so on and so forth. But what I was not seeing is merging the two, merging the ideas that could help with reading visuals, the ideas that help with understanding what words do in comics, since it's a bimodal medium that combines the two. So I feel like what was lacking is those types of links between each of the critical approaches that are available to comic studies now.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point that, and I think you use the word comprehensive in the dissertation quite a bit. And in a minute, I want to hear how you define the word comprehensive, right? Like what is a comprehensive study supposed to be? But I take your point that, in literary studies, maybe it's less emphatic now, but you still see, people will publish a book on the history of the epic, right? Or, I mean, I'll make a nod to our GFR and his discipline right there. They still publish, like 900-page histories of Europe, right? Or histories of Africa, right? Here's a history of a whole continent in 1,000 pages or something like that. These kind of sweeping studies. And I think you're probably right that comic studies doesn't do that. I mean, one could argue that MacLeod is an attempt to do some of that, but I take your point that MacLeod is more structuralist than anything, right? MacLeod is more interested in here's how we define the structural elements of comics, right? He's not as interested in, say, history, right, or cultural history or cultural studies approaches. That's not what he does. So he is maybe less comprehensive in that regard. But so one of the things I'm always curious about is I agree that I think comic studies is probably less comprehensive in critical approach. I'm also wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think the reason for that might be, right? Like I could tell you why I think, literary studies still does this sometimes, right? Or why it's moved away from it. But I'm wondering, do you have a sense of why critics might not want to be comprehensive, right? Or why that might not be their initial aim? Because, when I read chapter 1, and we talked about this in the draft stage, right? I think I said a few times, like, but these critics don't want to be comprehensive, right? Like Charles Hatfield is not trying to be comprehensive. That's not necessarily his goal. So I'm wondering, why do you think critics avoid comprehensive approaches in comic studies?
I'm not sure that they were avoiding being comprehensive. I don't think they were avoiding it. I think that comic studies was fairly new, and in order to understand something that's or help everybody understand something that's new like that, you'll have to start somewhere. And I feel like this somewhere is like, let's see what comics do that other media do not do. And that's why we go to the like we start with the panels and the pages and the gutter and the like those types of elements that do not necessarily exist in or do not exist in prose or in cinema, for example, and to try to understand those and help readers understand those before you can get to a point where you can devise a critical mode that attends to the different elements. So I don't think it was a matter of avoidance as much as it was a matter of wanting to really understand things. It was an early stage when they started. I think it was an early stage of understanding a medium that existed for so long, but its study came late into the academy. So I think that this is why it was there were some shortcomings and drawbacks to some of the available tools, because I don't think they were aiming to be critical tools to begin with. I think they were aiming to provide readers with ways to understand the different elements and not necessarily to understand how to conduct a critique.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe some of this is temporal, right? Some of this has to do with the relative novelty of comic studies as a field, as an academic field, right? Fewer books, therefore, it takes more time to develop these kinds of approaches. Okay. So I don't want to. I want to let everybody else talk too. I'm sorry, but I do want to ask just one more thing related to that. So we talked. Obviously, the interrogative mode is made up of different critical approaches, right? Like the whole basis of the interrogative mode is that it borrows certain kinds of approaches as a way of developing that comprehensive approach. So this is the last question I have for a minute, and then I'm gonna have everybody else ask some questions too. But what are some things that what are some approaches in comic studies that you find particularly valuable for the interrogative mode? Like, I mean, you're not saying like all comics criticism isn't useful. In fact, you kind of say, in many ways, you suggest the opposite, right? Like there's so much that's useful, but it's not brought together very much, or rarely brought together in the way you're describing. So what are some of the approaches that you think are most valuable, like that the interrogative mode builds on?
I personally like the semiological approach that Grunstein presents in the system of comics, because of this idea of thinking of a comic as a network or as a web of elements that are interrelated and interconnected. The only thing that I hope Grunstein did, was that he admitted that words are part of this network, and that like the verbal track is as important as the visual track. My biggest issue with this approach is that it sort of didn't want to consider words as part of the equation, and this is where I sort of lost interest. But I think with the interrogative mode and the fact that it puts Thierry Grunstein's ideas, and it takes it and it links it to other approaches that highlight words and highlight the role played by words. I think like it makes it more more applicable and more useful that way. If it's used in connection with something else that addresses that sees the role that's played by the verbal track and sees how it's important as part of this big network or this web of relationships. I think this is what I needed to see and I couldn't. But like in the end of the day, if this idea of thinking of a comic as a web is taken and applied to different works, I think it helps readers conduct a comprehensive critique and also understand the work better.
So do you want us to step in and launch
Sure.
into some questions?
Yeah, I have lots more, but I'm also cognizant. I don't want to monopolize the time. So yeah, others feel free to jump in as well.
Okay, I will. I've already sort of corresponded with Noran about some of these ideas. I was just thinking about the whole project, and I don't remember whether you use the word heuristic in there anywhere, but that's basically what it is. And the fact that it's designed mostly as a pedagogical project might be kind of misleading because I think it's something else. I'm wondering, this is a big question I had from the whole project. If you think of this interrogative mode not as a teaching device, but as a tool for critics, and you being that critic, what kind of insights would it lead you toward? And if you could pick one favorite text, I don't know, Persepolis or Cairo or Little Nemo, whatever, how does using the interrogative mode change the way you might think about or write about that text?
Good question. First of all, I think like maybe I should probably pick a work first, like pick something that I think could use the interrogative mode and benefit from it. Let's say, for example, I'm looking at Watchmen. It's the easiest example that comes to mind. So when I read it before devising the interrogative mode, I think I didn't notice what was happening on the page. I didn't notice, for example, this idea of simultaneity. I sort of overlooked this because I was reading it seeking a narrative, seeking a story, and seeking maybe like looking more at words and what words do, you know, the dialogues and the you know, like in the intermissions where there were some documents that you needed to read in order to understand the story more and so on and so forth. So reading the comic without the direction that the interrogative mode gave me towards looking at what was happening on a very regular page layout, like what's in Watchmen, you know, a very regular layout that doesn't do much. It doesn't break conventions in the sense that it's the grid layout, but without thinking about this idea of simultaneity and seeing the past and the present on the same page and things like that, I would need the question of the interrogative mode that helps me think about time and how time is portrayed, whether it's the narration time or the time of the events and things like that. So as a critic, if I didn't have the interrogative mode, there were some elements of this comic that I would have overlooked. I wouldn't know how to compare what happens in the comic itself to the documents available that are not in a comic format, the documents in the intermissions between the different comics in this series and so on and so forth. So I needed those questions that direct my attention to things that I think a newbie or a reader who's not an expert would need to see. But even as an experienced critic, some of those things need direction. I think I needed to, to draw these links, and I think that the interrogative mode is what leads to drawing these links between the different elements that make this comic what it is.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. Have you done enough of the kind of critical reading on Watchmen specifically to know whether anybody has successfully highlighted that? The kind of simultaneity that you're talking about, which I think is a really interesting idea. I'm wondering if that's part of your sort of underlying claim, is that the current critical discourse, by not incorporating all of these points, all of these perspectives, fails to notice important things about comics. And so in this particular case, is that true, that they've failed to notice?
Not necessarily. It's not like the critical readings I did on, like, the critical approaches to reading Watchmen do notice this aspect. However, my problem with those types of texts that would just focus on Watchmen is that sometimes what they notice in Watchmen are things that are not in other comic books. This aspect is not in every comic book that you'll read, right? So this idea of focusing on this one work and noticing those things about it doesn't make this approach applicable to other comics. So this is what prompted me to taking this one approach. This is one idea of looking at Watchmen and understanding what simultaneity looks like, and applying it to the comics that have this aspect. And the fact that the interrogative mode is open enough to encompass questions and approaches that do not just focus on this aspect and do more, makes it more applicable to other works. If a work that doesn't use this device of telling the story, then there are other questions that probably address some of the things that it does. And when it fails, there's also the question of what does the comic you're reading do that the interrogative mode cannot help you with? Like, as a reader, what do you see in the comic you're reading that the interrogative mode doesn't address? So it gives the reader the freedom to create their own approach.
So one thing it can do is sort of help embed this one text in a larger, I hate to use the cliche word, but a conversation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, can I sort of jump in with sort of a related point? I mean, this is one of the things that I find kind of interesting about the dissertation as a whole, and maybe it's something we can kind of branch off on, right? Like, you picking Watchmen, right? Like, so, and as you say, like, Watchmen, Mouse, The Dark Knight Returns, like that's the Trinity, right? Like, those are the three that come up way more. If you look in the MLA bibliography, you'll see more entries for those than anything else. So it's pretty likely, you're going to get a lot of different critical approaches to those works, just by virtue of, volume and visibility, particularly historically where they happen, right? And so one of the things that I think I hear you saying, and I want to make sure I'm right about this, is that, there are critics who, let's take simultaneity, right? That there are critics who have certainly pointed that out about Watchmen, but in ways that don't necessarily approach or lend themselves to other works, right? So it sounds like one of the things you're saying is that simultaneity might function differently in Watchmen than it does in something else, right? Is that right? So if that's the case, I mean, I'm wondering then if part of what you might be suggesting is, and this is maybe just my invitation for you to say a little bit about this, are you suggesting that maybe comic studies has been too focused on particular texts to the detriment of method? In other words, like, is comic study, everybody writes about mouse, right? Like, is part of the problem that just we're not looking beyond a core set of texts, or that the arguments are too insular about individual works? Because I was thinking of like Andrew Haberik's book about Watchmen, that's all basically about Reaganomics and Watchmen, right? I mean, it's about the 1980s, and it's part of that Rutgers series, University Press series in comic studies, and they have books on Wonder Woman, Frank Miller's Daredevil, Watchmen. They just came out with one about race in EC Comics, but they're typically very focused on a particular character or title. Do you think that's the case? Is part of the reason for the interrogative mode and a way of trying to make connections, or as Brian said, like start a conversation across works that just aren't brought together? Or is comic studies too focused on specific works as opposed to methods?
Absolutely, yeah. And this starts with a definitional approach, for example, and how it wants to limit the definition of comics to the regular comic, the comic you're used to, either the one you see in the newspapers or the regular comic book. And if you look at like all the books that focus on interpreting a single work, you will notice that this work has to have been noticed. That it has to be a critically acclaimed work. In most cases, I can't say this about like all of the books that are available. However, most of them do that. You'll notice that most of them, as you said, like it's usually Maus, Persepolis, and I think the Dark Knight Returns, and Watchmen has been has been exhausted like that too. Like there's plenty of either works devoted to Watchmen as like just Watchmen, or works that have to address Watchmen or critique Watchmen, to say that this is an example of how you can read comics, or like to project what Watchmen does as if it stands for all comics. However, and this is definitely a problem. This is one of the things that I think led me to the direction of trying to find an approach that doesn't do that, that looks at works that haven't been studied enough. It could be useful because of what they do on the like, not necessarily as like what their topics are. Because I think one of the main reasons those works are studied that much is because of their seriousness and their sophistication, which sort of contrasts what comics have been known for a while. Or at least that's what some people believe. And that's why I thought, like, how about comics from other cultures, or comics that are not necessarily critically acclaimed, that do great things, like experimental comics, for example, that do great things, to say things about this medium that are not necessarily studied that way, or not, they're not even known to readers as much as those are. So yeah, absolutely. I think that comic studies have been so focused on specific works and sort of didn't do much with others.
Well, you could probably also make a claim about, like critical renown or prestige not necessarily being a good arbiter for understanding comics in general, right? I mean, like you said, like Watchmen, Maus. I mean, these are widely known as, as you said, I think you said sophisticated, right? Sophisticated examples of the medium. But there are many comics critics who would argue that you could learn just as much about comics from an issue of Power Pack, which maybe that's a bad example because some people like that one. But like I'm trying to think of a really bad like Doofus from Fantagraphics or something like that, like just one of these kind of absurd comics that gets no critical recognition because it's not seen as particularly sophisticated, right? Or like the Family Circus, let's use that one, right? Like the Family Circus is widely regarded as just a popular, but for some inexplicably popular, but not especially sophisticated newspaper comic, right? But there are plenty of critics who would argue that you could learn just as much from the Family Circus as you can from Maus, right? There are many who would say you couldn't. What do you think? I mean, do you think that something like, I mean, it doesn't have to be the Family Circus, but like a comic that you would just say is not very good or aesthetically accomplished, do we get just as much from those works if we want to if our goal is to understand comics?
Yes, there are examples, you know, like, again, like one of my issues with specifically the definitional approach is that it tries to limit what kind of comics you can learn from, or what kind of reads are comics. I think it depends on what exactly you want to learn from them. If it's a matter of understanding comics, then definitely you'll find things that will help you at least make a list of, like, this is what makes this comic what it is, and make a list of, like, the main aspects that do that, and then compare it to another comic that's probably more sophisticated in you know, the visual layout, and both the visual layout and the topic that it addresses, and understand comics in a different light. So I guess that there isn't a comic that wouldn't help you understand some aspect of the medium. I think each comic you will read will at least lead to understanding a specific aspect, or like a number of aspects that might not be available in a very serious and very sophisticated work.
I want to ask on that then, because while we're on this topic, see if I could work this all out. I've been writing notes. Okay, so in your dissertation in chapter 1, you have all of these different categorizations of how people approach comics. What I never understood from your dissertation, and this is going to lead to the question I'm talking about, are those your classifications?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious why you didn't explain that.
I don't know. I don't have a specific reason for that. Maybe I shouldn't.
Well, what I'm wondering with that is because it sounds like often you're putting stuff on these scholars that I don't think they're saying, but it's your interpretation, which is okay. But like, you label a thing called the definitional approach, and then you have other approaches, and it's like you're lumping people with multiple goals as if they're all trying to do criticism. Very few of them are. And so I'm trying to figure out what to you is the difference between comic studies, comics criticism, and research on comics. What are those things? How do they interrelate? And how does that apply to what appears to be your exigency, which is that there's a severe lack of instructional material to teach criticism to new critics, which I think is extremely valuable. But I don't really get the, I don't know if that's exactly what you're going at. That's kind of what I'm feeling it. Does that sound right? What do you think about those? That's kind of a lot of stuff all at once. I don't mean to overwhelm you, but those are just some thoughts.
I totally get your question, and I think it's a great question, because I don't think any of these works calls itself a critical approach, or like none of the critics or the writers calls themselves a critic, or their approach is a critical approach. However, those are the texts available to critics. As a comics critic, I want to find something to help me understand a comic, right? And those are the texts available to me. All of them, like, or let's say each of them does something that's helpful, but doesn't instruct me on critiquing. It has a certain something that's valuable to me as a critic, but it's not necessarily shaped in a way that makes it a critical approach. And I'm not saying all of them, but the majority of the available texts. So these are the available texts, and they include some approaches, but I don't think they're shaped in a way that is, you know, instructional, or that leads you to understand like what to do when you're looking at a comic. Very few of them do that, and that's the issue here. That's why I was trying to find what their approaches are, and like I gave them those names or titles based on what they attempt to do, or what at least I interpret from what they're making available to readers. And it's an attempt to create an approach that's based on those ideas that each of the books or the approaches do.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that your categorizations are interesting. I would like you to explain them like how you just did on why you came up with them. And I'm also just still a little bit concerned that it's still trying, like, why should any of these texts be doing that? Like, why should they be offering that? That's not their goal. So it seems like you are almost assuming that should be their goal. Is that fair, or what do you think of that?
No, definitely not. Like, I can't criticize something for not doing something that I wanted to do, right? But
Sure.
again, those are the available, this is what's available to readers. Like, this is what again, like as a scholar, I want to find something that helps me with reading comics. And all of them are helpful in some way. But there is a specific need for the reader that none of them fulfill. So I'm not saying that they don't do it and that that's bad about what they do, but I'm saying that it's bad about comics studies in general, that it doesn't fulfill those needs, or like doesn't answer some of the questions that are still, that are still problematic to the reader. So that's my basically my critique of what's available to comics scholars or critics.
That's good. I think you should include that in your dissertation.
Yeah. Can I just say too? I agree with what Rob said, actually, that I think it would be really good to say a little bit more about. I really like your point that that's what's available, right? Like, this is what the discipline of or the field of comic studies provides for students, researchers, etc. And because I sort of have the same question, right? Like, I'm thinking of somebody like Bart Beatty, who's one of my favorite comics critics, right? Like, Bart Beatty takes a sociological approach to comics. That is his, like, his book Comics versus Art is all about why the art world, and he means like the metropolitan based art market, has this very complicated relationship with comics, from talking about everything from, Liechtenstein paintings to the sale of comics art at Sotheby's. Like, so he's not interested in how gutters work, like he's not. And I agree, like, there are times in that first chapter where, to Rob's point, it sounds like, as a reader, I come across moments where I think, oh, is she criticizing someone like Bart Beatty for not being interested in how gutters work? But how would the book ever get finished, right? Like, that's not, that would be asking comics critics all to do the same thing. And I get the sense that that's not what you mean to do, but I take the point, definitely, that, there are ways where you could say this is what the field provides for its initiates and its experts, and that what you're trying to do is to bring these things together. And maybe this speaks to a related question I have that's kind of emerging from this conversation as to what, and I think Brian alluded to this a little bit ago, but like, who the audience of the interrogative mode is. Because again, it does seem largely designed for students, right? So maybe to this end, to what you've just said, could you say a little bit about what a student, you've already talked a bit about what a critic gains from the interrogative mode, but what does a student gain? Because I gather that this is the primary audience. I don't think you've said that exactly, but my suspicion is the primary audience for this mode are students. And you can correct me if that's not accurate, but what would they gain? Like, what are some, or could you just point to a couple of what you think are the most valuable contributions that this approach would make for them?
Sure. Yeah. So because I started reading comics as a student, I needed some direction. I needed something that leads me towards the things I need to look at in a comic book, because I'm more used to just reading words, and interpreting words and seeing links between words and things like that. So I needed some questions that could help me see comics for what they really are. So my hope is that the interrogative mode with its questions can give students some critical questions to help them think about comics critically, to help them see comics for what they really are, um, but not necessarily to define comics for them, but to help them understand where they need to be looking, what exactly do they need to be looking at when reading a comic book for writing about it. First of all, for reading it, even if it's reading it for understanding the work. So reading for understanding, but also reading for commenting and critiquing, for commenting on and critiquing this work. So it's a set of critical questions, leading questions, questions that can help them understand and help them conduct a critique, but also can lead them to ask more questions, because some of the questions can't be answered in the words they're reading. Some of the questions can prompt more questions that address some of the things they see in a comic they're reading that might not, the questions of the interrogative mode might not be focused on or might not ask questions about.
I have a related question too, in terms of, I mean, I think, and I don't remember if I sent this in the email or not, but I think, you know, as a sort of outsider who's not initiated to this literature and doesn't think about these questions, I mean, I think anybody who's writing a dissertation or who's getting ready to write a book, one of the central questions, or you're going to a job interview or you're putting out a book proposal, you have to sort of answer the question of what's the contribution of this piece of literature, right? So, and I think a lot of this questions are the questions that I had about, okay, you know, because I started reading and it's, okay, I'm looking at this from a, you know, maybe a child's perspective of, you know, you pick up your first comic and you're like, which way do I read? How do I do this? And then you jump into sort of, okay, here are some useful things for students, as you were just saying, and then to critics. And it ramps up pretty fast, right? So for me, as someone who's not initiated, you know, it sort of became a bit complicated. And part of the thing that I started thinking about was, you know, to what extent is someone going to actually use this, right? As a reader, I could see for critics for sure, right? If this is what you do, then yeah, this is all very important. But I think I'm not, and I wasn't so sure that that's the case for, you know, someone who's a sort of average reader. I'm not sure if a, you know, 12-year-old Noran would like really get this and say, oh, okay, I have this new method that I'm going to read these comics. So I guess that's a lot to say, sort of like, what do you find is the sort of contribution of this? Where do you see this sort of situated in the rest of what's on the subject?
Okay, so I think that what I wanted this interrogative mode to do is to help college students read comics. That's the very initial idea that I had, but I also wanted to include some things that could help the regular reader, someone who's not familiar with ways of reading comics, or like who's totally new to the medium, who's never read comics ever, to be able to find some helpful questions that can help them understand a certain work. So I think that the interrogative mode in its current state still needs some more scaffolding, because again, like in its current state, it's a dissertation. It has to speak to an audience that is, you know, I think like is supposed to get what it does with, you know, like linking different critical approaches and the fact that it wants to help the regular reader, but it's not the thing that the regular reader will get. You know, a reader who's not, you know, a part of academia, or who's not necessarily, or doesn't want to be a critic, or doesn't want to conduct a critique. So I think in its future form, it'll have more, I think, more scaffolding and probably sections that speak to different readers in different ways. Because definitely, I totally agree with you that a 12-year-old reader or someone who has no idea what comics do might have an issue with understanding like even with the very first questions that I asked about the cover, the book cover, and what like any reader would be like, what do you need me to see in the book cover? Like, what exactly are you asking those questions for? So that's why I think like more scaffolding and more like tailoring the language I use towards the audience I'm addressing will be needed to make it more more useful and to contribute to that specific audience. So it depends on who it goes to, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely in its current state, it like you guys were my audience, and that's why it might look a little more uh, like a difficult read. But I think that later when it's it's going to it's going to address a different type of audience, then I think that then it will look a little bit more different than it does now.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to its usefulness too, right? I mean, you know, I've been reading comics with my daughter and as I was reading, I was sort of thinking, you know, what are some questions that I could pull from this to ask her? And I think that does speak to the usefulness that, you know, if you sort of parse it out, you could say, okay, you're a college student, here's sort of set of questions for you. You're a kid who's just starting out reading comics, or you're a super comic nerd. You know, here are some different types of questions, you know, sort of suited and aimed at you. And again, I think that does speak to its usefulness. You know, so I think that's well done. Yeah.
Just kind of following up on that, for me, the most helpful sort of sequence that you use sometimes is to sort and then pinpoint and then reintegrate. And I think you could highlight that more and say, this is the basic technique that I'm using. So I'm taking all of these ideas and I'm giving them a kind of order, and then I'm focusing in on this one, and then I'm showing how it fits into a larger picture. Do you find, is that what you were trying to do, or have you thought about that as the basic method? Not in the interrogative mode, but in your writing of it.
I don't think I did. Like when I was writing, I think I was writing to understand first. You know, like I was sort of writing to understand before I put the different approaches or thoughts together to make the interrogative mode what it is. So, but I think that this is, yeah, what you just suggested is very useful. Not just to, definitely to the reader. I mean, like to me as a writer, the way I wrote, I think like I understand it, and as I said, I wrote like that in order to understand. But for an outside reader, I think that this will be helpful.
Can I just kind of chime in with it's striking me as we continue that some of what Brian, Zach, and Rob have just said, like they all kind of speak to, I think, a similar thing, which is the way in which the interrogative mode is framed in the dissertation, right? Because one of the things that I wondered when I read, especially it's chapter 2 that kind of really introduces the interrogative mode. I sort of wondered, and maybe this speaks to what Zach was saying, like if you're a 12-year-old, but you know, I kind of wondered if I were reading that as a beginning comics reader, I might run the risk of being kind of atomized or being pulled in so many different directions. I have to ask questions about everything, right? And in some way, I think Brian's point about there is a kind of system in how you're framing the interrogative mode as useful. It doesn't mean readers need to like absorb every single aspect of this, but rather that the interrogative mode might be a way of understanding different elements of a comic that add up to something comprehensive, but can also but are ultimately you know, like I think by framing it in the way Brian's suggesting, there's a way of drawing attention to how you use this, as opposed to just you're gonna absorb everything. Like you mentioned a minute ago, covers, right? Or like, and I was thinking about, so this says more about me and what I read to stay awake with a 3-month-old. But I've been reading, you know, on my iPad the early 1980s run with Doug mentioned Bill Sienkiewicz of Moon Knight, this kind of off like weird C-list Marvel Comics superhero character. And there's a certain point in 1982 where if you look at the cover price is $1. Now that means absolutely nothing to most people, but what it means for like a reader like me is I recognize, okay, if it's $1, that's what Marvel did when they were publishing things in magazine size, so 30 full pages, no advertisement. So it was a way of making up lost revenue. It also means that it was sold to the direct market, so only to comic shops, right? Not the supermarket or drugstores or things like that, which also means it was considered slightly more adult. And therefore, so if you read like Moon Knight and you just look at the art or you read the text and you think, okay, this is a little bit edgy for an audience of children. If you understand just what the cover price means, then you realize that it wasn't for kids at all, right? But that's like one big history that emerges from one tiny facet. And so, if you read the second chapter, if you look at all these different elements of the interrogative mode, all these questions together, I do think there is a risk of the reader feeling pulled in so many directions that they can never master the comic, right? But maybe the question I want to get at is, and this is thinking about, again, practicality, which is a term you use quite a bit, practical criticism, right? I guess I'm wondering, like, sometimes when we assume, you start out with that approach of, well, a lot of people assume that reading comics is easy. Kids grow up reading comic books. And that makes a lot of cultural assumptions in the first place about gender, about nationality. But leaving all that aside for a second, there are obviously some comics that we're not talking about when we say, oh, kids can easily interpret comics. Like, are there certain kinds of comics, whether they're genres, particular works, particular titles, that you actually actually require the interrogative mode more? I mean, I could think of some like experimental or avant-garde comics that children very much do not grow up reading, thankfully, or that, I struggle to interpret, right? And so I'm wondering, like, are there certain kinds of comics that you think really benefit from the interrogative mode, or elements of comics more than others?
I think that definitely the more complex and the more non-conventional the comic is, the more you'll need to think about things that are not the very first things that come to mind when you think of comics in general. I'm thinking now of is any of you familiar with Asterios Polyp?
Yep.
Asterios Polyp. It's a comic by David Mazzucchelli, and it starts with the cover of the book. Like, the dust jacket is intentionally frustrating. Like, it doesn't really fit the book. And like, for a reader who thinks that, why is it designed like that? Or maybe this is a mistake by the publisher or something like that. But this is part and parcel of the main themes of the narrative. And like the fact that the interrogative mode, for example, asks you to think about the size of the book and the book cover, and like whether it's related to the narrative itself, and whether it sort of echoes some of the themes, and asks you to read the comic itself and try to understand it, and then go back to the cover and see if there is any connection between what the narrative does and what the cover does. So in such cases, I think the interrogative mode could be helpful. And then the idea that it asks you questions about the reading path, or whether the comic is, whether you can, some comics like this one or many others that are experimental in nature, you'll have to flip the book to actually read if there is a sequence, to read this sequence, or to see what's going on the page and things like that. So I feel like that the questions and the fact that they direct you or lead you to think about those things and why they're set this way, or like why, not necessarily the intention of the creator, but the effects of that on you as a reader, and like how it matches the themes or the main messages that the comic is sending you and things like that. So I feel like like experimental comics could be a good place for the interrogative mode to work. But again, as I did in chapter 3, I used it for reading some regular conventional comics, and I thought that it could work too, because again, like it helps you sort of test out some of the available tools for reading comics and seeing how some of the approaches succeed or fail in some cases. So it could shine with specific types of comics. It could be more useful with specific types of comics, especially the ones that are not necessarily, that do not fall under the umbrella of regular comics. But I still see that it's useful for reading conventional ones and traditional ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like part of what you're getting at is that one reason for the interrogative mode's existence is to kind of counteract this idea of comics, their assumed simplicity, right? And so that can work for something. I mean, I try and think about what comics would really benefit from this. And, you know, on the one hand, I could think of like the Fort Thunder school, the sort of experimental 2000s era, aughts era, like, oh gosh, I forget the guys, Brian Chippendale, who wrote the book Puke Force, which is just this abstract expressionist mess, as the title sounds. I mean, it doesn't really have a narrative. And so like non-narrative comments or non-sequential comics are also, but at the same time, something like, and this is a series I don't really like, but it works for this purpose, like Johnny Ryan's Prison Pit books, which are this kind of crudely, you know, drawn, I mean, it's deliberately looking like, you know, a middle school artist, just this kind of Dungeons and Dragons inspired, extremely violent fantasy. And, you know, I can imagine someone looking at that and just saying, well, this is just mindless, right? And that's part of the point, right? Like part of it is about toxic masculinity. It is about sort of role-playing game cultures, bad elements of role-playing game cultures, tied into a kind of right-wing online politics, right? Like that's the point of it. I mean, it's also supposed to be just really crude humor. And so you could see that on the one hand, with the experimental Fort Thunder book, you could see someone reading that and just saying, I don't know even how to interpret this, right? You can see someone interpreting Prison Pit as, well, I know exactly what this is. This is just mindless, you know, we don't even need to ask questions about it, right? So it sounds like maybe one of the goals of the interrogative mode is to think about getting people to ask more questions of comics who don't, right? Like it would not just be, I'm going to help somebody understand these sort of formal or structural elements of comics. It also seems like kind of a push to get especially new readers or even like a common reader or popular readers to maybe think more, right? To ask more questions about what comics does as a medium.
I just want to add one more thing, and this is based on the teaching experience that I had with Dr. LeVay when we taught this comics course. When students were asking us like what do we need to be looking at? Like we asked them to come up with their own critical questions or to write reading responses to some comics, and some of them were great, but there was always something missing. There was always certain aspects that they were not not really looking at, or they were not considering as part of the critique of the works we read. Although most of the works we read were, you know, traditional in many ways, except for Chris Ware's The Smartest Kid on Earth, Jimmy Corrigan. But other than that, all of them were very traditional comics. But still, like I feel like this idea of seeing what the visual track was doing in comics was still something that they were not seeing or they were not trained to look at. And that's when I thought that maybe providing them with some questions that lead in that direction can be helpful. So I feel like the questions here, the interrogative mode provides readers with lead to that direction. I know that there are many and they are overwhelming, but they are something. I mean, like, you can look at them and like, you don't have to use all of them. And I think this is something I say in the outset, like, you don't have to use all of them, but they're at least help you think about they lead you to the type of, the kind of questions you need to be asking of a work of comics, if that makes sense.
This reminds me also, I was sort of thinking about the pedagogy of this, which I think is really useful. And I'm even thinking in terms of history, there are a sort of unwritten set of questions that we want students to think about, and we'll ask them sort of piecemeal, and I don't think it's very clear that there is this sort of set of questions. I wonder in other genres or literary fields if this is a sort of more common practice. Like, for example, if you're teaching poetry, are there, you know, is this a sort of more standard form of like, here are a certain set of questions that you need to be thinking about?
I don't think so. I don't think that this is a common practice. I think that it's usually, like, you usually ask the students to come up with their own research questions. Isn't that right? Everybody.
I might actually push back on that a little bit, because it depends on what the level of the course is, right? But if we're talking about introductory, like if you're doing an introduction, like an introduction to poetry or to literary analysis, you probably would have some sense of like, here are different kinds of questions. Like one of the most famous or the most well-used kind of poetry textbooks is Helen Vendler's book on poetry, which has a section of like, here's a list of questions to ask when interpreting a poem. I mean, I think, but I think maybe relating to what Zach is saying, you know, I kind of wonder if this comes from, again, what literary studies does or doesn't do, right? Like so I'll go back to Bart Beatty for a second. Bart Beatty in Comics versus Art says that one of the real detriments of comic studies is that it's kind of dominated by literary studies scholars, you know, that there need to be more art historians and people in other film studies scholars, you know, which is in some sense where comic studies really originated. But there need to be more approaches, because literary studies often approaches issues in very similar ways, right? And going back to the teaching thing, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things, like you Noran, you were saying, is that a lot of our, and this was the class we co-taught for the internship, a lot of the students really read in terms of plot, like we're reading for the plot, right? Or they read in terms of theme. And they had trouble, I mean, they could notice certain things, like they were pretty good about, say, the difference between a black and white or a color comic. They were pretty attentive to kind of realism versus caricature. But when it came to other kinds of formal elements, they seem less, they seem to notice those a lot less. Right? But I think that, you know, like if you were to teach an introduction to fiction, right, an introduction to the novel, you would probably say a bit about like, here are some questions to ask, or here are some ways of approaching narrative, right? I mean, that's narratology, right? So I don't know that literary studies just as a whole doesn't do that. I mean, I think it does, but I think it depends on the class. If you're in sort of an upper level class, there is the kind of assumption that, okay, people know the methods, but if you've taught an upper level class, you know that that's sometimes a very dangerous assumption to make. But yeah, I mean, I want to hear a little bit more about kind of your response to teaching, and some of what Zach was saying as well, right? That how you use this in the classroom maybe does depend a little bit on the audience and what you want each audience or level to get from it. I can imagine someone taking a comic studies course, an intro comic studies course for the first time, needing to know different things than somebody who's taking a senior seminar.
Yeah, I think like in my own experience, I've seen that like you're always given examples of the types of questions you could be asking of a specific genre or a specific work or something like that. But I don't think I've ever seen, maybe that's just my experience, I've never seen anything that's as extensive as what I do here with the interrogative mode. It's something that, you know, like tries not to leave anything uncovered, or even like the things that I don't cover, like I tell readers, go find those and try to answer questions about them. But yeah, I feel like what I intended the interrogative mode to do is to to change, to transform in every context that it's used in. So in an introductory level course, I think, as I mentioned this a little bit in chapter 4, what I want to do a lot of scaffolding, because I think that sometimes the very first few classes is where you sort of you explain things and you go over the syllabus and you tell students what they'll be doing, but it's not necessarily, you might think that you've covered that and that they know what they're supposed to do, but like a first year student will still be confused about what you need them to be doing. So if I do use the interrogative mode in a classroom context, there will be a lot of introductory, like a series of introductory classes on like why we're using this or how we're going to use it, and very simple, like, you know, like building up, like starting with very simple examples and going to more sophisticated examples and so on and so forth. And the current syllabus that I designed is something in the middle. I don't think it's necessarily for an introductory course, but it's still not necessarily a course that you'll teach for fourth year students or graduate students or something like that. So I feel like, again, like it will change depending on what type of audience it's addressing, and the level of familiarity that students have with the medium, and this is something you will test out in the beginning of a course that you're teaching. But like for me, for example, I will know from the very beginning that if it's an introductory course, there will be a lot of scaffolding that will have to do at the very beginning, to help make it more useful or more understandable to a beginner kind of audience.
I have a
I want to add
three-part
in
question.
something.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Oh,
Go ahead.
well, I was just thinking about the fact that a lot of the same issues that we're talking about here are addressed in other fields, and that might be something to broaden the framework of your project, is to say these are approaches to multimodality, which is a whole theory of learning. The one I thought of, just because of the work I do, is theories of picture books. And there's a book by Perry Nodelman, for instance, called Words About Pictures, The Narrative Art of Children's Picture Books. And there's another one by Maria Nikolaeva and Carol Scott called How Picture Books Work. You did bring in film theory, Altman. I think there's some stuff that Seymour Chapman has done and others that would also, I'm not sure how to integrate it into what you're doing, except to say, for students, you're going to be facing these kinds of interpretive challenges in other areas, and this one might help. And then from a critical perspective, to say, we can draw on the way you did with Altman, which I thought was good. Primarily a film theorist, but what he has to say about kind of visual narrative, and especially I think you could say more about his walking you through that Bruegel painting, which is a direct challenge to Scott McCloud and the narrative in a single image. So that's not really a question, but do you think that you could frame what you're doing in a way that might point readers towards some of these comparable, parallel projects?
Yes, and I think like I mentioned that somewhere. I think like it was at the end of chapter 2 where I tell readers you could sort of draw or borrow questions from other disciplines or other approaches that are that you find useful for the specific work that you're reading. But I also want to do some of that. You know, like there are certain things that, especially with film studies, when you suggested looking at Eisenstein's theory of montage, for example, I found plenty of things there that could be very helpful for understanding comics and the concept of sequentiality, because I think what it led me to is this idea of that writers, like comics creators, whether it's the writer or the illustrator, they usually have a sequence in mind, but the fact that they break it in a certain comic and like scatter the story in a way that seems that it's not in a sequence doesn't mean that there's no linearity in the writing process. For example, like when they sit down and put the storyboard, or like when they think of the story in their mind, there has to be a certain sequence. If this sequence is broken in a work, doesn't mean that there's no connection or a line that brings all of these things together. So I started seeing things in other disciplines, especially with film studies, and I also was thinking about visual studies and how much I can bring from there to the interpretation of the visuals. I keep thinking of the very first time I looked at the Mona Lisa, for example, at college, when we were asked to think of like what this this image, or this painting does, and we couldn't have any answers. It was my very first year at college, and I had no answer whatsoever. None of my colleagues in class had any idea of why this painting is important, or like why it has this fame, this universal fame and things like that. So taking some of those ideas, those things that I learned from visual arts, or that I still need to learn from visual arts, and linking them to the questions of interrogative mode, I think will be helpful. And other parallel disciplines that have methods that could be useful to what interrogative mode does. I definitely can't cover everything, but at least like have some vectors that lead readers towards those directions, so whatever they don't find in the interrogative mode, they might be able to find in other disciplines. So,
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Sorry, Brian, I just jumped in again. My question is actually related to Brian, so that worked out well. It has 3 little sections though, so I'm going to kind of like lead into it. I'll try to be quick. The first one is pretty much what Brian was asking. I understand you can't cover everything, and that makes total sense. I'm not trying to get you to, but what I think you might be able to do is choose what you should cover. And so what I'm asking on that is, I was kind of surprised, I guess, about what some of those things, like I didn't see much mention of multimodal theory. There are many comic scholars in multimodal lenses that answer a lot of your questions. Same with visual rhetoric. Technical communication, generally speaking, has been talking about a lot of these questions you have for about 30 years. So there might not be answers in comics criticism, but people have talked about comics outside of it that I think is very parallel to the interrogative mode. Which gets me to my main question. What is the interrogative mode?
Okay.
This is so let me reframe that. Let's pretend like this is an elevator pitch, right? So in 1 minute, explain to me what it is.
Before I get to the other things you asked about?
You don't have to answer those. That they were all build up to this question, and then we'll get to it. So yeah, what is the interrogative mode?
So in a nutshell, the interrogative mode is an analytical reading strategy that brings together critical approaches from by different critics, by different comics studies scholars, and it puts them together in a question format to help readers understand comics better. And I argue that those questions can lead them to conduct a more comprehensive critique of a given work of comics.
Okay. So then this is, I went in the wrong order. So that other stuff I was saying that muddied the waters, now I'm bringing that back. How does it differ from rhetorical analysis?
Well, I think like rhetorical analysis, and definitely today it's different because of multimodality, right? This idea of that you're not, when you do rhetorical analysis of a text, this text doesn't mean, that is not necessarily a written text. It could be a text that that is composed of different modes, right? But when we like, I think like the traditional way of defining that doesn't necessarily include comics much, or at least from what I've seen. Um, but I think that I don't know enough, or like just because this is not my specialty, I haven't seen enough of what visual rhetorical analysis does with comics. I don't think I've seen or I've done enough research there, because I needed to start with what's available in comics studies. I wanted to look at what comics studies do first before I looked at, you know.
So what is comic studies to you then? Because you've been saying that throughout, and I don't know, everyone I've talked to has a different definition of it, because I would argue that a lot of these things I'm talking about are part of comic studies.
Mm-hmm.
So what is comic studies?
In my knowledge, or the way I would define it, is studies that focus solely on comics, on what makes a visual narrative, and in the sense of like, I mean, a comic book or a comic strip or a newspaper comic, or this type of visual narratives that are different from other visual narratives like photo essays or other media that combine words and pictures.
Okay. That's great. I'm curious, because the reason why I'm bringing these up is because while, yeah, you can't cover everything, I think a lot of your dissertation is treading into ground that is far more multimodal, far more visual rhetoric based in comics. And there is lots of stuff out there and you're not really covering it, which you don't have to do. It's just that your kind of argument is that there's a gap in knowledge, but I would say there really isn't. It's just maybe there's a gap in comics criticism knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe you can specify some of those things, or because goodness knows you don't need to do another, 20 tomes of reading. You've already done plenty.
Yeah.
But maybe we can specify where your argument is based in, so that you won't get these critics coming in saying, but wait, what about this guy? What about Duncan? What about them? They've all answered these things. What about in interanimation? Because like interanimation is a theory that you don't discuss, and I think it answers a lot of your questions.
Yeah, and I think
It's
like
out there.
the reason why I wanted to sort of respond to your initial statements is because I'm not claiming or arguing that there's nothing out there that can be used for reading comics. Like now that you mentioned multimodal theory, there's definitely useful methods and approaches there that can work with comics. But I think the main reason I didn't go there first is, again, just because I wanted to see what comics critics, like those who claim that their main focus is comics, like I wanted to see what they offer first before I go and do research on, visual rhetoric, rhetorical analysis, multimodal theory, and all of those. The same way I didn't look enough in film studies or visual arts, or the other disciplines that can be as helpful, or at least helpful in a way, for reading comics. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah. So I think like what I'm getting from what you're saying here is that that defining the scope and saying what exactly I'm critiquing, or what exactly, like where the gap really exists, is what I need to do and make clear, so I don't make it seem like I'm arguing there's nothing out there that is helpful. Is that right?
Yeah, it was kind of, I guess, a tricky way to do that. So yeah, that's definitely what I was getting at. I'd also point out too, and this is the third part, and then I'll promise I'll be quiet for a minute, is that interestingly, there is also education research on prompting. So from what I can gather from the interrogative mode, is it's a series of question prompts, which actually is pretty similar to visual analysis done in rhetorical circles. A lot of them actually overlap, but you have plenty of unique stuff that makes yours great and unique. But there's also research in education circles that might be of interest to you on whether or not prompting is an effective educational scaffolding. There's actual qualitative mixed method data and some quantitative data on it, which might be of interest too. If you might get if you have critics coming in from that way when they're asking you, well, what about the research done in education on using prompts, stuff like that. It's just so you're aware. You don't have to do this for the dissertation at all. I'm just letting you know that there is a branch of knowledge out there too that looks into that. Now I'll be quiet. Unless you want to respond to anything else I've said.
Yeah, go ahead, Noran.
I just wanted to thank Rob for the suggestion, because I think that, again, like, this is what I wanted to gain from the discussion here, like ways of making this, first of all, not argue things that could get me in trouble, because I don't want to get in trouble, but also, you know, be as useful as possible if there's other disciplines or fields that I can benefit from to make this a more applicable method. Then yes, definitely I'll do some research on those. Not necessarily for now, but I mean for the.
No, yeah, definitely. And I'll let you talk, Mike. I just wanted to say that I feel your pain, because, you know, when you start dabbling in comic studies, you're getting people from across academia. And so this is like just kind of my 10 years of going to conferences and getting attacked. Now I'm presenting it to you in ways, for whatever that's worth.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I've been to one of the conferences that Rob was talking about with him too, so I know exactly what he's referring to. I mean, I would say, just sort of a related point is that comic studies, I mean, it is multidisciplinary, and I think it's increasingly so. You know, like, I think one of the good things about comic studies is that we've started to take, I'm going to use Bart Beatty again, but like, we've started to take his advice, you know, that literary studies is not the only field that can understand comics. And I think oftentimes comic studies has a very cultural studies or literary studies approach, right? And there's this wedge sometimes you can notice between the kind of formalist approach that Noran, you were talking about with, say, McLeod, what you call definitional or structural, right? Like McLeod, Gronstein, this kind of, you know, the language of comics kind of approach, versus comic studies as a way of understanding, say, the X-Men in the 1960s and 1970s as a relation to civil rights and other political ideas, right? Like, we see that a lot in contemporary comic studies. And I think one of the things that I would echo about what Rob said is that, you know, your conclusion talks a bit about becoming interdisciplinary, right? That the interrogative mode in future iterations needs to incorporate more disciplinary approaches. And I think this is a really good example of that, because I agree, like, and this is sort of tacking onto the list of works that Brian was mentioning. I was thinking about W.J.T. Mitchell and books like Iconography and What Do Pictures Want, you know, where that's a literary critic who is thinking about visual rhetoric in slightly different ways than, you know, you might see in other rhetorical approaches, but it's still embodying different ways of bringing in these methods. And what I see in your conclusion is an awareness that, you know, you can't read everything, and, you know, and maybe this is the issue with comprehensiveness that I would encourage you to think about. You know, how do we define comprehensiveness? Like, is there any way of fully achieving that, especially if the idea, as you say, behind the interrogative mode is that there's always more to add? And that's not just because there are new comics or even types of comics emerging, right? The rise of web comics, you know, that's one reason to continue to adapt the interrogative mode. But there are others that don't have much to do with comics produced. They have to do with systems of thought and methodologies, right? And so I totally agree and think that that's something you'll want to, for the future, consider, right? Like, what kinds of interdisciplinary methods allow you to augment or firm up the interrogative mode, while also recognizing that, you know, you can't, you know, it's almost impossible to imagine a scenario in which the interrogative mode becomes the key to all mythologies and you've exhausted every possibility, right? So it is a delicate balancing act, but I think it's worth considering, like, what kind of disciplines or methods do you want to bring in? And I would agree that visual rhetoric, visual analysis, like, that's probably one of them.
Absolutely. And I think that, so just a comment on so you had a question about comprehensiveness. And I think that maybe I need to define that in a better way. Because when I first thought about this idea of comprehensiveness, I was thinking about like leading readers to conduct a critique that addresses as many aspects of the comic work as possible, like not leaving things out. And this was, again, this was based on the fact that I noticed I didn't know how to interpret visuals, or even if I had ideas, I didn't know how to phrase them, what kind of language to use. And when I had the language, I wasn't sure what kind of questions to be asking, and things like that. So when I talk about comprehensiveness, I think I was talking about this idea of, again, thinking of the comic book as a network of different elements and aspects, visual and verbal, that make this work what it is, whatever the work is. And the fact that comics are different and there are different types of formats, genres, they discuss so many diverse topics and things like that, is where I thought that maybe drawing some methods from other disciplines can help notice those things, notice how those things are different in different comics, and so on and so forth. So I didn't necessarily mean that the reader will cover every element, but I meant it to be as comprehensive as possible, or as considerate of the different relationships as possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so recognizing that there's not an expectation that a comprehensive reading is one that contains everything, or even could, but it's one that has a greater breadth, maybe. Okay. I think, ironically, in a conversation about comprehensiveness and how much you can fit into certain time limits, I'm just looking at the clock. It's now 11:40. So we're approaching the end of our time together. I think I'm good. Does anybody else in the committee have maybe one final question, or are we ready to talk amongst ourselves and let Noran have a break for a minute? Okay.
I'm good.
Good.
Break.
Okay. All right. Well, Noran, I'm gonna ask you to leave the meeting now. Just so I'm clear, I am recording. Do I pause or stop the recording in this? I think I can do either. Do you know? Oh, yeah. Let me unmute you there.
Muted.
Yeah, I think on your end, you'll just pause because it won't record the deliberation. And then when I'm back, you can just click record again.
Okay, great. So, okay. So I'm going to pause here in a second. I'm going to ask you to leave the room. I will. You sent me your phone number, so I can text you when we're ready for you to come back. Okay. All right. Thanks, Noran.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noran.
See you in a minute.
Thanks, Noran.
Yeah, I just got it.
Okay, great. Okay, well, congratulations, Dr. Noran Amin. Although I think, yeah, there we go. Rob figured out how to do it over here. Oh no, Zach too. I wasn't.
What's that?
They put the clappy
the thumbs
hands.
up.
Yeah.
Do we all? Yeah.
Oh yeah, we could do that as well. Yeah. But we just wanted to say, a really. Shoot, I'm going to be the only one who doesn't do it. Oh, that's fine. I'll just use I'll put my hands. Yeah, really an engaging conversation, an engaging dissertation, as you obviously probably got a sense of from our comments. And I think just to speak for myself, I like a defense where the student is really, open to criticism and suggestions for kind of future iterations of the project, but at the same time doesn't just capitulate and disavow everything they've written or anything like that, because the criticism is all designed to spur your thinking, to kind of advance the project moving forward. And I think I certainly, I think we all thought that you did really well with that. So again, congratulations, really good job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you want to do your picture now? We can do your picture.
Oh, yeah.
The grad school. So the grad school wants us all to do this.
Sure. What I can do now is like
virtual one or actual
all
one?
at once.
I can
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
what's it called, like a screenshot.
Yeah, you can take a picture.
Okay. There you go. Done.
All right.
All right.
I don't know if you got
Great
mine.
work, Nora.
Thank you all so much.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
job.
Yeah, really good job. So, I mean, we obviously hopefully, and one good thing about this being recorded is that you can kind of go back and think about some of our suggestions. I was telling you the other day that my dissertation director told me I should invite another student to come in and take notes during my defense, because otherwise I would forget. And I didn't do it. And that's one of the biggest regrets I have, because I totally forgot what some of the feedback was. And it would have been really helpful as I went to, create some articles or
to take some notes, but like I don't think I'll be able to read them.
yeah, that might only get you so far. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad I have this, especially that that like also some people will not see me in a colloquium. Well, actually,
Right.
There's no colloquium, so nobody will see me doing a presentation on this. So like this will be
Right.
my way of presenting what I did. So
Yeah, which is great. And we and in terms of just, I want to go over before because I'm conscious of everybody's time. I did host the meeting until 12:30 just in case we went a few minutes over, but it's fine. Just for logistics. So the student has 2 weeks to deliver any revisions that they want to make to the graduate school for your final copy. So if there's any nagging typos, these are small things. A lot of our conversation and a lot of the things we suggested, my sense is that those are for what you want to do next, right? Like you mentioned, this kind of splitting this up. I often recommend just take some time away from the dissertation before you immediately start in on the next step. But thinking about if this were to be a book, I think a lot of our feedback, particularly some of what Rob was saying structurally and also foregrounding definitions and parts of the argument, would be really key. And that would, of course, mean shortening it. Like when I was told my first book had to be 90,000 words, that I got them up to 96, and that was about as well as I could do. Yours is a bit over 96. So I'm saying that with some exaggeration. So, there'll be some things you want to cut, some things you want to streamline. But of course, there's always time to do that. But I think if you have any smaller changes that don't drastically reconfigure the project, you have 2 weeks to make those. I just got the note from the graduate school today that usually there is a signature page required. Obviously, we can't do hard copy signatures right now, so the grad school is allowing electronic signatures. I can see if Devin can get us that, and I can just start the chain. We can do it by email or something like that, where each of us appends some kind of signature, or even if it's typed. I have a little like scan of my signature that I paste into electronic documents. So we'll be able to get that to you because that's one of the required pieces.
Do I get it? Is that something?
You need to include it with the full dissertation, which you send to the graduate school.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
yes, you don't sign it. All of us sign it, but you put it as like the first page or second or something. It's the grad school has guidelines for where it goes. It'll go in the full document that you deliver to them. And if you have any questions about submission, what goes in there, et cetera, Devin will be your best bet for answering those. So we all, not you, Noran, but the four of us, your examiners, we have or in the process of sending your feedback to the graduate school. So you may get a note from the graduate school kind of confirming what we've already said, basically, that you have passed the dissertation defense. So we all do that. There is also an assessment of the program. Did Devin send you a copy of that?
I don't recall getting anything like that, but I'm gonna look.
I can't remember if you're on that email or not. What I can do is, if you didn't get it, I'm just looking right now. If you didn't get it, I can have her forward it to you because the student does the assessment as well. Oh yeah, no, you got it from her on Monday, yesterday morning.
Oh, okay,
So
yeah, that one, yeah, I got that one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So all you have to do is fill that out and send it directly to her. That's just an assessment it's really used to assess the program. It does not factor into your performance or, our vote or anything like that. This is purely to assess the PhD program and how well it's preparing students for something like this or for the profession. So those are the only things that you need to do. Do you have any questions or anything we didn't talk about?
No, I guess I'm happy we did this.
Well, good. Yeah. Now
my
you
only
can
question
relax.
is that, like, can I tell people now to start calling me Dr. Amin and never respond when they call me Noran from now on?
Oh yeah, without question.
Right. Especially family members.
Yeah, parents love
Tell
that.
your mom.
Yeah. Having met your mother, I wonder how she would react to that. I think that would be fun. If you could record that and let us see, we'd greatly appreciate.
He started calling me Dr. Amin already this morning, so.
Oh, okay, good.
Excellent.
Confidence is good.
Yeah.
Whenever Zach just calls me Rob, I don't respond. I say, excuse me.
Yeah.
Calls me Dr. Watkins.
Yeah.
Good job, Dr. Amin.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, good job.
So,
Really.
yes, congratulations.
Thank you.
And you're welcome to reach out to probably all of us for, we could have conversations via Zoom or just email exchanges to follow up on anything that we've left sort of hanging.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I hope
absolutely.
this will not be our last conversation.
No. My dissertation advisor told me once that when she starts working with a graduate student, she knows she has that graduate student for life. And that's only a slight exaggeration, I think. Like this will not be our last interaction. But yeah, we're happy to answer all of us. And of course, me as the chair, if you have any sort of specific small things, feel free to come to me, and I'm happy to help with that, whether it's about the revision or what you have to do to submit your stuff. But yeah, it should be. And of course, like future plans, rec letters, I always happy to write letters and do other things, and also to look over this project afterward, as you start to think about what to do next. I mean, I think we've given you some feedback on what you can do next,
Right.
but yeah, those conversations can certainly continue too as you need them.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much, and
Yeah.
stay safe.
Yeah. Likewise, everybody stay healthy, and thank you for a great giving us something good to read during our during our enforced solitude, or if you're like me, like what you read with all your family around with no solitude at all. But yeah, we appreciate it.
All right.
Okay, thanks. So good to see everybody, and I'm going to end the meeting here.
Okay. Good luck.